can I ask everyone to do me a favor, which is to move up a little bit to the first two seats, so then people, as they filter in, they can be filling in the back. If you're worried about having to duck out, then you can take an end seat, but I want to make sure that Professor Cashin has like a group of people she can be looking right at as she's speaking. So if I can ask you, please, just to move up. So thank you so much for being here. My name is Michelle Stevens. I'm the founding and executive director for the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. And really quickly, that is an institute that was founded by a Mellon grant that Rutgers wide received about 2 years ago. And what the Institute has done is tried to create a network, an intellectual network of scholars studying race and social justice, gathering together from across all of Rutgers campuses. I'm very excited because even though we held a very exciting launch for ISGRJ-Newark last year in September, this is actually our first, given the pandemic, right? This is our first in-person event at Newark. And so I'm very happy about that, very happy that the Chancellor and the Vice Chancellor could be here. I'm not gonna say much more. There are others who are gonna do much more fuller introductions, but welcome and thanks for being here. I'm gonna turn things over. I'll say one last thing. This talk was initially thought of and instigated by our inaugural ISGRJ Newark director, Elise Boddy, who was a wonderful contribution to the starting of the Institute and representing Newark. Elise has moved on to very exciting, very challenging things and has been replaced by an equally wonderful, our second director, who is Professor Maite Green Mercado of ISGRJ Newark. So help me welcome her on.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks to everyone for being here. As Michelle said, I'm Maite Green Mercado. I am the new director of ISGRJ in Newark. And as Michelle was saying, I would like to welcome you to our first in-person event here at ISGRJ. It's really exciting to be able to meet people that I've been seeing over Zoom for a long time, like Michelle today, so this is a wonderful occasion. So ISGRJ Newark brings together a wide group of scholars and students across the university who are committed to the study of race and racial justice. They do so from different disciplinary and scholarly perspectives across time and space, and from our city, our state, our country, and globally. Staying true to the mission of Rutgers Newark as an anchor institution that is at once in Newark and of Newark, we engage in these pressing issues inside the classroom and by establishing dialogues and partnering with communities around us. This event, as Michelle said, was in the making for quite some time. The seed was initially planted by the inaugural director, Elise Boddy, who unfortunately is not here with us today, but we are very grateful to her for facilitating this timely and urgent conversation with Professor Cashin here in Newark. It is an honor to welcome her and all of you here, and I would like to thank two people who were instrumental in making this event happen. The Senior Administrator of ISGRJ Newark, Terry Coopersmith, and also our wonderful communication director, Tanya Bentley. I thank you both for your hard work. And I also want to thank Chancellor Nancy Cantor and the leadership at Rutgers for the support and commitment to advancing a shared mission and a vision of equity and racial justice. I did something. I'm very sorry. Oh, you did that? Oh, okay. I'm very sorry. So it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce the person who will be engaging in a dialogue with Professor Cashin today, Professor David Troutt, who will introduce our guest and will moderate this conversation. He is a distinguished professor of law and justice, John J. Francis Scholar at Rutgers Law School in Newark, where he directs the Center on Law, Inequality, and Metropolitan Equity. He emphasizes using law and interdisciplinary study in order to understand structural inequality and systemic racism, and to formulate legal and policy reform strategies. Professor Troutt teaches tort law, intellectual property, civil rights, and a multidisciplinary approach to racial and economic inequality, land use, civil rights, state and local government, housing, and poverty law. Professor Troutt is the author of 4 books, The Price of Paradise, The Costs of Inequality and a Vision for a More Equitable America, NYU Press, The Monkey Suit, short fiction on African Americans and justice, The New Press. After the Fall, Black intellectuals explore the meaning of Hurricane Katrina, The New Press, and a novel, The Importance of Being Dangerous, Amistad and HarperCollins. In addition to many scholarly articles, he writes frequently on issues of law, race, and inequality for a variety of national publications. A Harlemite relocated in New Jersey, Professor Troutt is the proud father of 2 tremendous daughters. And now please join me in welcoming Professors David Troutt and Professor Sheryll Cashin.
I feel so tall. Is it afternoon? Good afternoon, folks. And thank you so much, Maita. That was really so much more than I expected, and more than I knew that I've done. I'm not sure it's all true, but thank you. It's really my pleasure today to introduce my friend, my colleague, and one of my favorite thinkers, really about everything, not just about the subject of her book. So let me get briefly to an introduction so that she has all the time she needs to talk about the many interesting themes and insights in this latest work. Sheryll Cashin is the author of several important books and many more canonical law review articles. She is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice at Georgetown University School of Law. She is a daughter of Alabama and a graduate of Vanderbilt, Oxford, and then Harvard Law School. Professor Cashin eventually clerked after law school for Circuit Court Judge Abner Mikva, thank you, as well as the great Thurgood Marshall, Justice Thurgood Marshall of the U.S. Supreme Court. Professor Cashin is a true public intellectual and a civil rights warrior in whose irrepressible scholarship on race, inequality, segregation, and the Constitution, we see the critical fault lines that both divide and potentially join us. Her 2004 book, The Failures of Integration, challenged core beliefs about this goal for transforming the communities that we inhabit. Her 2014 book, Place Not Race, expanded on this analysis to show how place-based marginalization can effectively replace race as the central determinant of access. She next explored white supremacy in her 2017 book, Loving, Interracial Intimacy in America and the Threat to White Supremacy, a book premised on the Loving v. Virginia case in which the Supreme Court first declared that interracial marriage was constitutional and that laws against it were not. And she's back. She's back with a tour de force, and she's here with us to discuss her latest book, White Space, Black Hood, Opportunity, Hoarding, and Segregation in the Age of Inequality. Good people, please welcome an intellectual giant, a civil rights lion, and my dear friend and colleague, with whom I never take a step in my work without first consulting her, Professor Sheryll Cashin.
On days when I'm feeling down or insecure, I'm going to rewatch that video. This one, you know, his delivery's so smooth too. You know, I adore David Troutt. We went to law school together. You know, I think we're soulmates in terms of our desire to write, our obsessions really with writing. And so it's just a delight to have him introduce me and to be in his presence. I want to thank the Institute for Global Study of Racial Justice, Dr. Stevens and Dr. Green Mercado. I'd like to thank the Chancellor, Chancellor Cantor, who I've been in meetings with, you know. I feel like I know you very well, even though, but I guess we're fellow travelers in this work, and lovely to meet you, Vice Chancellor. I want to thank the Rutgers Law community, and especially you. Obviously, you have many other things you could have done with your time today, so thank you for coming out. This community of scholars, Sahar included, I found myself citing quite a bit. If you read through to the end, you will see citations to David Troutt, Rachel Godsill, the departed Elise Body. I'm very impressed with the Rutgers Law Newark community and how it spends time trying to make a difference in the lives of people with their scholarship. Okay, so I accidentally hit this button before. I have a 4-minute film that's going to orient you very quickly to the themes of the book. There'll be a pop quiz afterwards, but it'll make my presentation much more understandable. So let's see if I can.
Residential past is destroying opportunity. If high opportunity is sequestered only in certain places, neither cities nor struggling suburbs nor far out rural hamlets are an engine of opportunity in this country anymore. We're not the land of opportunity in this system of residential past. So I've been a professor at Georgetown Law for 25 years, and I've written a new book, White Space, Blackhood, Opportunity, Hoarding, and Segregation in the Age of Inequality. And in that book, I'm shining a light on American residential caste. So American residential caste is a system that was intentionally constructed to create affluent white spaces separated and apart from high poverty black neighborhoods. We overinvest in and exclude in affluent white space, and we disinvest and prey upon the people trapped in the hood. So there are 3 anti-black processes that undergird residential caste: boundary maintenance, opportunity hoarding, and stereotype-driven surveillance. Boundary maintenance is a polite word for segregation. The most persistent types of neighborhoods in large metropolitan or even medium metropolitan areas is affluent white space and high poverty minority neighborhoods, particularly black neighborhoods. They have persisted, and the boundaries to those 2 types of neighborhoods have gotten harder. We're more segregated now than we were 20 years ago at these polar extremes. Opportunity hoarding is overinvesting in affluent majority white space and disinvesting elsewhere, particularly in black neighborhoods. We tend to, use exclusionary zoning, neighborhood assignment, the boundaries of jurisdictions to hoard the opportunities there. Golden infrastructure in schools, wonderful transportation, job-rich social networks. Everyone else who's excluded from those high opportunity environments subsidizes that, right? Through taxation, through gasoline taxes, that gorgeous golden infrastructure is paid for and subsidized by the people who are excluded. And then the third is stereotype-driven surveillance by police and by private citizens. As with slavery and Jim Crow, a lot of non-black citizens have been conscripted into policing black bodies. Stereotype-driven surveillance is driven by this idea that kind of behavior is deserved in majority black neighborhoods. Police go through there with a lens of, every young man is presumed a thug rather than a citizen. The beauty of, once you understand the processes, they actually provide the way forward. You basically we abolish and reverse them. Inclusion rather than exclusion, with boundary maintenance. Giving historically defunded neighborhoods priority in investing rather than opportunity hoarding and disinvesting in blackness. Humanization and care rather than stereotype-driven surveillance. A city that's gone through abolition repair, what I imagine and envision is that they will have returned to being engines of opportunity, particularly for poor people in poor neighborhoods. See them as assets and give them a chance to be an agent in their own liberation.
How's that for optimism? Thank you. So I should say that it took me 2 decades to figure that out. I have a degree in electrical engineering, and I'm a self-taught historian. I've been obsessed with this, but I finally kind of came up with a systems analysis and came to this conclusion, you know, it's actually worse than I thought, how endemic it is. So let me just quickly get started so we can get to the Q&A, which is my favorite part. I always start with this slide. What are you seeing? You're seeing a map of Minneapolis. The star, how do I get I'm afraid to do it. Oh, there it is. Okay. This is where George Floyd was assassinated. One black dot on the left represents 100 black people. One red dot on the right represents 10 poor people. George Floyd was murdered in a neighborhood, a sort of bohemian, gentrifying neighborhood due south of one of the blackest and poorest neighborhoods on the south side. Many people don't realize the role of geography and segregation in this tragedy. I have a research assistant who helped me write this book. He grew up in this very affluent, majority white southwest quadrant, and he said, the police were almost invisible. If they were there, they were protectors, maybe directing traffic. And as a young adult, he had an apartment in Powderhorn, and he said here, you know, right across I-35, the police were hunters, right? It was a form of policing that would not be tolerated here, right? And this is the third leg of residential caste, stereotype-driven surveillance. The police department has a terrible history of violence, and it's heavily mapped. And my theory was that the kind of policing incubated in the hood was visited upon George Floyd and his neck due south. You know, meanwhile, Minneapolis has one of the highest standards of living in the country, but also one of the highest rates of racial inequality. And if, you know, a Martian or, you know, came down and saw this map, had no knowledge of the United States of America, you know, they might wonder, well, how did this come to be? It would not be possible for the thousands of individuals just making choices about where to live to construct this extreme segregation, what I call residential caste. It was constructed the same history that Newark and many other segregated cities have experienced, constructed that. Another tragedy in the news back in May, you know, the extreme segregation, this is Buffalo, 85% of black people in Buffalo live east of Main Street. And there's only one supermarket in Main Street, east of Main Street. This hyper-segregation made it easy for a domestic terrorist who wanted to go find black people and spray them down with an assault weapon without much risk of shooting white people at the same time. He did his research, he found East Buffalo, he found the Tops grocery store and was able to drive straight through it, animated by this white supremacist great replacement theory, which is just incredible. He couldn't be replaced by whites when he had to drive 200 miles, blacks, if he had to drive 200 miles to get there. Okay, here you are. The greater Newark metropolitan region. We have, you know, racial dot mapping. Black people are yellow in this map. Latinos or Hispanics, light green. Asians, blue, I gather there's a concentration of Asians there. Whites are rendered in brown. Other groups, particularly indigenous people, bears emphasis that indigenous people who are coded in dark green here are invisible as a result of conquest, right? We must acknowledge that. Well, this geography, as in other places, was constructed with great intention, and it has profound consequences, especially for children. According to an analysis published recently by the Century Foundation, the Newark metropolitan region is first in economic segregation and second in black-white segregation among all 403 metropolitan areas in the U.S. School segregation here is 3 times the national average. Anyone who lives in this area, as I assume you do, knows how this affects the distribution of opportunity in this area. I mean, in the metro area. And it's an extreme example, but Newark is not alone. And it's not doing it. Oh, there we go. Okay. This slide, sorry, let me just, okay. This slide shows the arc of my book. What I'm arguing is that each time this country seemed to have put to bed a peculiar anti-black institution, it created another one. From slavery to Jim Crow to the iconic ghetto, all 3 of these black subordinating institutions were animated by nasty anti-black stereotypes. The institutions have metastasized, as have the stereotypes. But whoever's got music playing, could you please stop? According to social dominance theory, human societies tend to organize as group-based social hierarchies in which at least one group enjoys greater social status and power than other groups. Most countries have origin stories, or what scholars call hierarchy-enhancing myths. And these origin myths promote patterns of behavior that constitute culture. And that culture reifies the existing hierarchy. And once such institutions are in place, we have a beautiful mythology. I say that positively about this being a land of freedom and liberty. We also have a competing mythology about white supremacy, right? Once institutions are in place, they tend to perpetuate themselves over generations, and people operating within these institutions defend the discriminatory practices necessary to upholding them as part of defending the institution. Our current system of residential caste is premised on these decades of anti-black stereotypes, but our division has also metastasized. In an era of toxic political polarity, we fight about masks and vaccines. Even infrastructure and paying for it can be controversial. With libraries and schools of late, we now have division about reckoning or not with past and present systems of racial oppression. And I want to emphasize, I'm here simply to tell the truth about how residential caste works and how it harms all but the relative few who can buy their way into what I call gold standard neighborhoods. You know where they are, the highest opportunity neighborhoods. Okay, so residential caste was constructed as a response to the Great Migration, to more than 6 million people moving from the South, black people moving from the South to escape Jim Crow and seek opportunity elsewhere. Between 1910 and 1950, the black population in Newark grew by 700%, 65,000 people that I lovingly call descendants, in honor of the acknowledging the continuum. I call the people trapped in high poverty neighborhoods descendants. They're the true descendants of American slavery and Jim Crow. And I guarantee you, the black people in this room have relatives somewhere in the South or ties to the South. Somebody, when you said child of Alabama, somebody went like that, right? Okay, but what happened? Everywhere black people landed in large numbers, the response was to contain them in their own neighborhoods through violence, through racially restrictive covenants, racial zoning. For as long as the Supreme Court allowed it, they strike that down, the exclusionary zoning. And those very neighborhoods where they were concentrated were cut off from all of the resources that were rained down on white neighborhoods. Excuse me, this is, okay. All right, and this telling a story about Newark. I read somewhere, I think it was in Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, that a lot of black people thought they had come to New York and just saw Newark and stopped. So it was just kind of a funny story. Okay, we need levity, do we not? All right, so this slide is for the law nerds in the room. It really emphasizes the role of law in institutionalizing residential caste, right? First, you have a anti-black stereotype that is central to the politics for adopting a policy. Law is used to put it in place, and then the law, in turn, help teach and perpetuate anti-black discriminatory practices among the white public. You can see over here in this column, right? They tend to conscript non-blacks into policing black bodies. These signature policies of the 20th century, a lot of them covered in Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, as the country was doing this over 7 decades, from the 1920s forward, they're working out the physical mechanism of white supremacy. In the Jim Crow South, you had the social mechanism of Jim Crow to keep people apart. And black communities everywhere, including in Newark, were subjected to cumulative blunt force trauma. Every one of these major policies, redlining, zoning, urban renewal, there's a story in Newark about that. But the major public policies that shaped urban space, mainly at the behest of the government, the federal government, were not good for black people. All right, so I have quickly some of the redlining maps. This is the greater metro area. As you can see, the first grade, highest grade is green, B grade is blue, C grade is yellow, D is, it says hazard, the 4th grade, it's literally hazardous. In Newark, every black neighborhood was marked with a D, and many immigrant neighborhoods. Almost immediately, this is in more than 200 cities across the country. Almost immediately, when black neighborhoods are marked with a D, and a lot of these neighborhoods are very, very vital, entertainment districts, business districts, they are immediately begin to be starved of credit and decline starts. And I cite in the book a recent Fed study, I believe it was from 2018, in which they looked back at neighborhoods today that were marked with a D, and they found overwhelmingly it correlates, that decision to do that in the 30s correlates with present segregation, decline, and disinvestment. It also has a lot to do with extraordinary wealth gaps. People who lived in these areas couldn't get credit to maintain their homes. Now, again, with Newark, we have the redlining, we have I-78 and Route 280 being laid, mowing through black neighborhoods, or laid to protect the more affluent neighborhoods from black people. We have the history of urban renewal. Newark was a leading city in mowing down with federal government money neighborhoods and replacing them with moving people into dense housing projects. And then also, obviously, you have this story of rebellion, not unique to Newark, almost everywhere. We have the same urban opera, right? These cumulative policies, a lot of social discontent, and then police brutality sparks rebellion. Happens over and over. I told that story in the book in chapter 1 about Baltimore. But as I said, that's the history, but residential caste is animated by present day practices. This is not the past. Current efforts to maintain boundaries, hoard opportunity, and surveil. I will have a few maps to underscore these different processes. My first chapter, I walked through this history with Baltimore. Why Baltimore? Because it was closer to me. It was more available to me. I could get on the train and go interview people. But during the 20th century, as many as 54 cities were hyper-segregated. This is the result of those cumulative policies I described. Here, black people, there's a colloquial term, the butterfly. You see the black butterfly and the white L. It's actually the white and Asian L. This geography sets up direct horizontal competition between communities of abundance and communities of need for limited public and private resources. And I want to underscore, and this is in Massey and Denton's classic American Apartheid, Black Americans, the great migrants and their descendants, were the only group in the 20th century that was subjected to hypersegregation, right? We are now, fortunately, down to 21 hyper-segregated cities instead of 54, and Newark is one of them. But there's still a lot of garden variety segregation across the country. It's actually, in the last 2 decades, gotten worse. And as I said in the film, concentrated poverty and concentrated affluence are becoming, the boundaries are getting harder to those neighborhoods. They're the most persistent type of neighborhoods. This is what residential caste looks like. And it alters race relations and politics. As what Massey says, and I've learned a lot from Massey, I read everything he's written, just about, where social boundaries conform to geographic boundaries, the social distinctions that come naturally to human beings become much more efficient. It's so much easier to talk about those people over there that you live apart from, to denigrate them, to render them scary. And the other thing that it affects is politics. Again, you have a horizontal competition between the most influential neighborhoods and the poorest. And over again, people in affluent space have a way of bending the major development decisions in any metropolitan area toward what they want, right? And overwhelmingly, the desires of black citizens. How often do you hear black people referred to as citizens, right? Their desires for the things that they want, the parks they want, or the schools, the investment, their vision of their neighborhoods don't get that kind of respect. I showed, ironically, this was part of the Baltimore study. Baltimore has a majority black, I'm sorry, I'm getting old and tired, but majority representation on the city council, right? It's had 7 of the last 8 mayors have been black, right? They have black power, at least, formally, right? But even in Baltimore, when a scholar, Dr. Lawrence Brown, I believe at Morgan State, actually went and looked at the numbers, to his horror and everybody else's, Baltimore was spending 4 times as much money in white neighborhoods as black ones, right? With their, development dollars, community development dollars. Now they're trying to fix it. They have a racial equity initiative, and they build racial equity into their city budgeting. In Chicago, it's 3 times. 3 times the public and private investment goes into white areas as black ones. It would be interesting, David, for Climb to get the stats on what's going on in Newark, right? But systems tend to favor, it just happens, just under people's noses, they tend to favor the white L's. They get their Candlestick Park, they get, a free circulator bus, they get light rail that easily gets them from the suburbs right down to the baseball stadium. What do the black descendants of Baltimore get? They get, there was a planned red line. I don't know if you've heard of it, but this light rail that was going to connect the poorest neighborhoods in East-West Baltimore to job centers downtown and at Johns Hopkins and out in the suburbs. There's an Amazon fulfillment center out there, right? Had been on the books since 1965. And when it was planned, it was called loot rail. That was the anti-black stereotype for the people who resisted. They called it loot rail, right? It finally was going to get built when Barack Obama's black Secretary of Transportation, I'm forgetting his name, gave Baltimore a $900 million New Starts grant, and the 15 years of planning, and the Democrats in charge of the state legislature, they matched the money, and they, finally we're going to build this. By the way, it takes 90 minutes by car, 90 minutes by bus to get out here, right? So it's really hard, and only 2% of the jobs in Baltimore are along this corridor. So everybody lectures to descendants, go get a job, but you have to get up and get on public transportation and get there. Anyway, what happens when the Republican Larry Hogan, within months of getting elected, he rescinded the red line? It was within his power to do it, and he reallocated 100% of the money that had been earmarked for the first stage, $750 million, to outlying road projects in white areas. Not one pothole in Baltimore was filled with that money, right? The Inc. Fund sued them under Title VI, and citizens sued them, and it just makes me mad every time, but I and some students worked together to do a FOIA thing to find out that somehow the Trump administration closed the initial investigation with making no findings, and I wrote about that. So that is opportunity hoarding. Hogan called it a wasteful boondoggle. And what did he do? He allowed the purple line that was going to connect the relatively affluent suburbs of Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. to Washington, D.C.'s metro. He allowed it to go forward and reallocated some of the money to that, right? This is the grossest story of opportunity hoarding, but stuff like that is basically happening consciously or unconsciously. This slide, how am I doing on time? I'm gonna wrap it up so we have time to talk. This slide reflects boundary maintenance. This is Houston. The pale area is majority white. Everywhere else is majority black and brown. A yellow star is a low-income housing tax credit funded project, and a blue star is a public housing project. Houston's Housing Authority admitted that it had located all of its public housing in 5 census tracts. Okay, so that's an intentional creation and maintenance of a ghetto, right? To atone for their sins, they proposed a multi-income project with some subsidized units out near the Galleria. People went crazy, NIMBYism. They got to the black mayor, and he canceled it. So I'll just quickly show you. You can see what's happened with Chicago's A Tale of Two Cities. Concentrated black and brown poverty has exploded here, as is concentrated influence. The middle class have been winnowed out. What do they get? They get waves of school closing, very, very rough policing, if you've walked around the Magnificent Mile or this part of Chicago, they have glorious public infrastructure. Right? That's the story. Philly, Camden, I left this in here because, you know, y'all know Camden. But see that there's several maps. This was developed by Paul Jargowski at Rutgers University, right? He did a series on the architecture of segregation, and these maps really blew me away. He had 32 of them showing that this is 40 to 80% poor. The footprint of concentrated poverty is exploding, and meanwhile, cities with the Back to City movement, you know, white space, affluent space is being cleared out. But as I cite in the book, the same period in which cities were so-called, you know, renewing, Black occupied neighborhoods in particular were actually getting worse in the same time. Why? Because of, you know, disinvestment and money's being poured into the affluent space. So it's not a happy story, but I want to leave you with some hope. As I said in the movie, once you understand the processes, you know what you need to do. But you know, the harder problem is building a politics to do it, right? But I do show examples in the final chapter of people building power. I think there still are a lot of people who do believe in their hearts that Black lives matter. Building power and coalitions for something new, right? And I want to applaud, in particular, some of the innovations in Newark. Despite a national rise in homicides, several majority Black communities, including Newark, Gary, Indiana, Savannah, they actually reduced crime. They reduced violent crime between 2019 and 2020 through social experiments, universal basic income pilots, hiring former offenders to help diffuse gun violence, deconcentrating poverty by moving tenants out of high-rise public housing to higher opportunity neighborhoods. The main point I want to leave you with is, if you can change the lens applied to descendants from presumed thug to presumed citizen, see them as three-dimensional human beings, assets who can contribute to society, who have great things to contribute to society, and could be agents in their transformation if given a modicum of investment and help, it frees you up to focus on evidence-based strategies that actually cost less and produce better, more humane results than what we're doing now. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you. Yeah.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
So this is the Q&A period of the afternoon, and I'm going to just moderate, but I thought I would take the moderator's prerogative to just begin with one question for Sheryll. So I want to begin from where you just left off, actually. So you mentioned that one of the most important points to take away is how critical it is to recharacterize the idea of Black people. And that's extraordinarily important. It's really one of the things that we've struggled with since we came to these shores. But I want to ask you more broadly about how we do that. How we do that in ways that are more likely to produce the kinds of changes that you urge us to do. You talk so much about structure and about institutional mechanisms reproducing these horribly unequal outcomes. So we have the language, we have the rhetoric, the labeling of Black people here, but beneath it, in almost a more stable foundation, are all these institutional practices that correspond to this characterization of Black people with the characterization of the spaces that they occupy as unequal. How do we talk productively about change? What are the kinds of I mean, if people are really trying to have meaningful conversations, not just about not seeing black people as thugs, but as actually changing some of the structures that you are able to document. You know, how does an average person start thinking about how to have that dialogue with folks who are obviously resistant, who have grown up on the thug?
Right, so I'm not a big fan of dialogue in the abstract, right? What I'm a big fan of is campaigns to gather power for a specific policy or for a specific candidate who's committed to, you know, racial equity or whatever. So one example I give in the book is Minneapolis, right? Minneapolis recently repealed its single-family zoning ordinance, right? And which it seems like modest, but for you and I, we know that's actually radical, right? In many cities in this country, it's illegal to build anything other than a detached single-family home on 75% of the land, right? And that's comes out of anti-blackness, why we have that defensive posture. Well, you know, some academics and some entity not-for-profit that was committed to cultural education on this spent a couple of years in shoe leather just giving a presentation to any civic group, any church, any group that would listen, slides, just telling this history. And the response of so many people was, I didn't know. This is unfair. And it changed the politics. The repeal of the single-family zoning ordinance passed through the city council by 12-1. And the one holdout was the representative of that affluent quadrant, right? But 4 or 5 years before that civic education process, it would not have passed. You know, people might have been hysterical. Now, I think George Floyd's assassination also, well, actually, I think it started on this before that. But the point is, rather than try to talk in general about race relations or everything, you know, gathering power and making it clear how citizens of all colors are harmed and showing successes, right? Showing successes where there was a little bit of transformation, you know. That's why I cited the example of Newark, right? Your mayor followed the model that Richmond did. You're familiar with where they hired former felons, right? So the guy who thought about that, right, he saw former felons, people who'd left gang life, as the most expert people on gun violence, right? They know more about it than anybody else, and they're actually the only people who can actually help transform this problem. So they turn people who had been vilified into civic heroes because they're playing a role in the transformation of their city, right? And so, you know, Richmond reduced its gun violence by 50% by, you know, casting these young men who were doing very thuggy things, by the way, as potential change agents, right? And they talked about them as the children that they were, you know, and they wrapped them in love and gave them 24/7 mentors, you know, a 24/7 peacemaker fellowship. So, you know, if you can get a little bit of success like that, you begin to transfer the narrative. But talking in the abstract and also talking to the people who are most advantaged by this system is, you know, it's like going to be talking to a stone, right? Yeah. But so many other people understand the ways in which they're harmed, you know. So I hope this is helpful.
It is. I just wanted a quick follow-up. I know I promised I'd go right to the audience, but I want to stick with this single-family zoning option example because it's such a fascinating example, and it's from a hyper-segregated area. But we have seen this movement begin across the country, particularly in parts of California. And I just want to be clear, was the appeal to disbanding or reforming strict single-family zones in the Minneapolis area, was that an anti-segregation thrust? Was that the way that was talked about as public policy?
It was premised on the
unfair history
It was.
of redlining and so there's a lot of talk now about addressing the racial wealth gaps. I mean, I must say, Richard Rothstein has done an amazing public service. I wish I could get some of his mojo, right? 1 million people have read his book.
Especially since you'd written about so much of that beforehand.
Yeah, we won't go there, but yeah. Whatever.
Universities are about truth.
Whatever.
And, we are very grateful to Richard Rothstein.
No, but
However,
1 million
he did not invent redlining.
Right, but
there
1 million
are scholars who've been writing about it for decades.
You're my brother, whatever. But anyway, but people have read that book, and he humanized them. And I talked to him about it before I wrote mine, and he said, I tried to tell stories of African Americans, honorific stories, and that's what I kind of tried to do with Descendants and yeah.
Sahar?
Thank you so much. It's good. Thank you so much, Professor Cashin, for coming and enlightening us. It's wonderful to see you again. Thank you, Professor Troutt. So one of the issues that I'm not an expert on race and place, but one of the issues that I've always been struggling with is the intersection of class and race. Sometimes that is used as pretext not to deal with anti-Black racism, which is, oh, let's just focus on class and poverty as a way to kind of whitewash or remove or ignore anti-Black racism. But at the same time, when I was looking at your maps, I highlighted that they were high poverty and high density of racial minorities, particularly African Americans. And so I'm curious to understand from your expertise in looking at space and race, how do you address this quagmire of dealing with the fact that these are highly poor, impoverished areas, and how do you spread the wealth and deal with wealth inequality and fix that, which is, I think, clear as day, without erasing the very real anti-Black racist motivations?
Well, I don't know how I do all that. But so one thing I try to say in the book is we need more complicated language if we're going to accurately reflect what we've got. And people have been talking about race and class, and there are a lot of people who want to say, well, isn't it really class now? And frankly, in some ways, forgiving, trying to diminish that role of race. But what I truly believe, and I think I've shown, is that we've replaced the pre-civil rights caste system that was based solely on race with a different class system that's at an intersection of where you live, your socioeconomic status, and your race. And so we have a topology of neighborhoods. The extremes are very Black poor hoods and very white, increasingly white and Asian affluent spaces. Those are the extremes, and but everybody in between gets a different deal than affluent white space, right? And it's just, I just try to tell the truth, and it's racial truth as well, and you can't understand it without following this history. But I do believe there's something about telling this history of unfairness. I couldn't even get to it, but while in Newark and everywhere else, they were concentrating Black space, they were spending billions, just scads of billions of dollars on developing white suburbs and only allowing whites to go into there. Just trillions of dollars rained into that space. So it's highly constructed. And when people begin to understand that, oh, that's what the wealth gap is about, I see a softening among people who are already in metropolitan space, who are kind of open-minded. The people who benefit most from this system, they're not volunteering. But there's just more openness, I think, and the math is getting easier in progressive cities. You just have to win in the city council
you know, or win in the zoning board to get started on something new. And I think sometimes trying to do all of it, or, you know, this stuff was 7 decades in the making. I think breaking it off into pieces and saying, okay, let's first have racial equity in budgeting. As we go forward, we get these new infrastructure dollars that are coming down the pike. Historically redlined neighborhoods should be first. Let's go to them first. Let's see what they need. Let's ask the people who live there what they need. Let them be in the charrette and them actually have agency in shaping their communities, right? Let's get started on some more inclusionary housing. There's, you know, duplexes, microhousing, ADUs, you know, there's things that ordinary people can afford, right? Let's get started on more humane policing. Let's just get started, right? And let's vote for candidates who are about an agenda of building an inclusive, high-opportunity city for everyone, right? I prefer that than debates about is it more race or is it class or whatever. I don't know if this is responsive, but I am excited that a lot of cities are innovating.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry that I didn't acknowledge my colleague, Professor Aziz. Right behind her, the gentleman in the mask. I think he had his hand up next.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Cashin, for the talk. One of the questions I had is, you know, when you're showing that chart, it went from a series of like material and groundedness to increasingly abstract. And I thought of, you know, the Republican strategist Lee Atwater, who talked about, you know, initially you start off with saying the N-word, then you start to talk about busing, and then you get to talk about high taxes and raising taxes.
Right. You don't even have to use race anymore.
Exactly. And there's this way in which you don't have to use the language of race, but you are referring to race, and people understand that. And there's a way in which the market sort of gets laid by the wayside, but the market is always involved in the race, right? There's racial capitalism. Capitalism is always racial. And the question that, part of what I wanted to point out is, you know, you talk about Richard Rothstein, he's done wonderful work, as you pointed out, but some of the critiques of Richard Rothstein, like Kia Muhammad Taylor and others, is that Rothstein focuses too much on the federal government and the role of the federal government and maybe the state government, but not enough on the market, not enough on private actors in shaping redlining. And there seems to be this way in which there's a kind of civil rights model for addressing racial inequality. And it seems, as you pointed out in the past 20 years, you've seen increasing segregation, and it seems that the civil rights model is kind of left behind. So you talk about black leadership in Baltimore, there's black leadership in Newark, but, you know, Professor Trout's work around, you know, increasingly private LLCs are buying up homes in Newark, right? People in Baltimore didn't even realize that you saw this investment in white communities. There's a way in which there isn't quite an understanding in which there's these kind of incentives and disincentives to produce these highly, you know, productive white spaces and all these kinds of rules in the market, and they see the market as this kind of abstract space which, you know, let the market function as the way it should function, as opposed to kind of creating kind of industrial policy that is, you know, to your point about these kind of racial equity commissions, or in shaping the law in such a way that the market isn't seen as something that's abstract and outside of race, but something deeply informed and shaped and does shape race, and that the market isn't kind of this thing that we should essentially piercing the veil of the market as being something abstract, as opposed to something deeply embedded in creating racial inequality. And, you know, maybe some people are a little touchy about, you know, developing laws and legal systems that go into that space. But the question I have for you is the kind of civil rights model we have around housing, around space, a bit outdated for the kind of segregation that you've identified, given the kind of increasing that, you know, we talk about, you know, black leadership of cities, but yet right under the very noses, you've seen this kind of massive inequality through using market mechanisms. And how do we infiltrate market mechanisms that reproduce this inequality with a different kind of legal architecture or policy architecture?
So I am not like a critical race scholar. I mean, I'm not self-identified as such, but I'm realizing that actually I must be, because of the, you know, I do what critical race scholars do. But one of the agreements I have with the critical race scholars' critique of the civil rights movement is that
it was largely an anti-discrimination regime, right? That depended heavily on lawsuits of individual bad actors, right, to try to correct. And the critique is that that just was not sufficient to dismantle systems, right? So I think it's like we need both and, but I call my final chapter Abolition and Repair to say we need to attack the systems, and government does have a role to play. But I agree with you. I cited Dr. Taylor. Her name is. Right, Dr. Keeanga Taylor. I cited her work. I cited this new exciting scholarship around racial capitalism. Right. This is why it really blew my mind how awful it is. How much I cited all the predation, financial predation, right? That's still going on in private equity, buying up all these homes and reselling these homes to frontline essential workers on installment contracts, which was a form of predation from back in the 60s. It's back. They're selling houses that they bought out of foreclosure to vulnerable people on layaway and under contracts where it's designed for them to fail. They want them to fail. They get no equity, and then they churn it and go get the next victim, right? So it's like what little wealth and earnings essential workers have is being transferred to titans, right? And yes, that discourse, it needs to be exposed. It's horrific. The one word that I heard when Ta-Nehisi Coates was talking about his 16,000-word piece in the case for reparations was plunder, right? It's just plunder black bodies, plunder their homes, plunder what little wealth they have, right? And that is racial capitalism. So yes, I think we need to have those critiques, and it can be part of the discussion to say this stuff should be regulated, and the orientation of local governments, progressives where they have power, should be to be clear-eyed about this stuff and stop it and regulate it, and with their own investments, try to get habits of racial equity. We actually haven't had these habits ever, right? But get started on building something new in that direction. So I'm very sympathetic to your question, though I don't have all the answers.
So thank you so much, Professor Cashin. Thank you, Professor Troutt, for the conversation. So I really appreciate you raising civic education, because what I found myself thinking about, both in your talk and in the question and answer, slavery was an economic institution.
Absolutely.
Right? You started off by saying you're interested in what's systemic, right? Like, I feel like the complexity of the systemic nature of this that articulates race and class is old. And so when you said, and I think as academics, we're analyzing it, but we're only talking to ourselves, right? So when you gave those examples and just use that phrase, civic education, if we're not out there talking about it with people in a way that they can get, right, then the knowledge just stays locked up in the academy, right? And so there's something, it's a comment and a question, it's something about I appreciated your giving positive examples, because I'm also a psychoanalyst. And so I have seen instances where when you share the history, what floods out is shame, right? And if you're providing civic education and you're aware that the first thing you're going to get is shame for those people you described in the middle, right? Not the affluent and not the poor, but the people who are like stunned by what they're hearing, right? Then there has to be a way to provide them with something they can do.
Exactly.
And this is what I heard about what you were saying, local policies. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more, just comment a little bit more on what brought you to civic education. Like, it feels like I don't want us to gloss it over, because the analysis can get stuck in the academy.
Right. Well, when I say so, I come from a civil rights family. I come from a family of political activists, and it's not just civic education for its own sake. It's just like getting people engaged in understanding how they can gather power and go to the zoning board meeting and demand something different. You know, and find allies. Civic education, when people campaign for office, they're engaging in civic education when it's done in the ideal way, you know, like talking about actual policy rather than dog whistling and, you know, name calling or whatever. But if you want things to be different, you have to bring people to these ideas, right? So there has to be some civic education, but, you know, I prefer to think of it as like, we got a campaign to get inclusionary affordable housing. We got a campaign to get, you know, racial equity in schooling, right? You know, you and I used to be on a board of an organization that would teach people how to go into communities and grassroots organize, you know, to create stable coalitions that would fight on a lot of these fronts. So, so I've given this talk in so many places, and I typically get this question, what can I do? And I say, individuals alone cannot solve this problem. So the first thing you should do is find the organization in your community that's doing the best work of gathering power. And it may be around a particular issue, but you know, there's lots of different organizations out there. Like, who's doing the best work of building out power among descendants, you know, hopefully cross-racially, right, for fairness and equity and something different than the status quo. And join them. And I try to emphasize, there's joy in this work. There's joy to be had in this work. It's a lot more joyful than sitting at home and being depressed about what's going on.
Hello. Hi, Professor Cashin. It's
Hi,
good
Rose.
to see you. Hello.
Good to see you in person.
So I wanted to just first say that the law school loves this book so much that we assigned it to all of our 1Ls to read. It was our share. So that's over 300 students who read the book during orientation. And then I also assigned it in my class. And so thanks for coming to my class last week. You've preempted somewhat my question, and that is, what would allyship look like? In that you're right, we need to not only work in collaboration in pushing the federal and state and local governments, but we have to work locally and work on an issue basis. I'm just curious, in the work and the research that you've done, what were some of the challenges towards coalescing around an issue in terms of building true collaboration and allyship?
Well, I'm just a writer. You know, I will admit that, you know, I have the luxury of reading about coalitions and, you know, reading, you know, deep accounts of particular ones and picking the ones I like and featuring the ones I like. I was you know, as I said, David and I were on this, how long we were on that board?
A long time. Felt like decades.
You know, we did our job. I mean, we were sort of in the fray, but I personally was not in the fray on the ground in DC fighting for X policy, right? You know, I was writing and raising my twins and keeping my head down and trying to live, all right? So I can't speak authentically to that work, you know. I'm familiar with the work of others, but, you know, every city has these stories. I try to feature, like, let me give one of my favorite examples, Louisville. Louisville used to be a hyper-segregated city. Now it's just segregated. I mean, but there's a big difference for people on the ground between hyper-segregation and moderate segregation. Its schools are fairly stably integrated. You know, after they got out of a school segregation order, they had built up a civic culture around their schools. People wanted to keep their integrated schools. And what happened was, this is over the course of 20 years. I tell this story in the book. But somehow, I think it was church-based, people started becoming, you know, I guess, cheerleaders for public education. And as their schools became more integrated, there was more choice to be had in where to live. people knew that no matter where they lived, they could get their kid into school that wasn't going to be overwhelmed by poverty. And surprise, surprise, the housing segregation came down. And there is a very strong culture. Yes, there are people who want to change it, but that coalition is held together. And it didn't just happen organically. There was some organizations of intention around it, right? So it just shows that it's not necessarily helpless, but each city has its own story and different organizations. And yes, there are places where it's going to be much harder.
I think we have time for one more question.
My question is related to, I had the experience of serving for 12 years as mayor of one of the cities you had up on your map.
Can you tell us which one?
Irvington, New Jersey.
Okay.
And so my question is twofold in the development of cities. And one is, what is your thoughts about the Community Reinvestment Act and challenging banks to do more lending and investment in urban neighborhoods? And two, what is your thoughts about private capital, particularly among Black and brown business people and professionals, investing in those neighborhoods that are highly segregated? And sometimes, because I spend a lot of time recruiting people to make investments in communities, and I do that as a consultant now, the value of those communities are not recognized by some of our own people.
Yep.
And then when other people come and invest, it's gentrification. So, you know, what are your thoughts about developing a movement to get people to invest, and how do we use the Community Reinvestment Act to force the financial institutions to do more?
Well, I'm not an expert on CRA, so I can't speak to its details or how you leverage it. I will say, though, that this is not the answer you want to hear, but I just think that the cities themselves, in ones like Newark and others, anywhere where great migrants landed, are so implicated in this that there is an obligation, a moral obligation for them to repair what they helped create. And if you've got the city and the leadership of the city say, okay, we are going to be about racial equity, we are going to be about having programs and things to do the rest of it, that will help to the leverage interest, partnership, those kinds of things. But I think citizens will have the easier time mobilizing to demand something different from cities. And there have been, particularly in progressive cities, I don't think this is a hard sell, once the story of segregation is told. I'm just not an expert on how to, leverage public and private investment. What I'm expert is shining a light on things that are wrong about what private sector does. I will say, the other thing I'll say is that the new regulation, which requires affirmatively furthering fair housing, is going, if let's hope, the Biden administration is enforcing it vigorously, and that we have a subsequent Democratic administration and some stability in the enforcement of it for 5 or 6 years or whatever, or in perpetuity. But the requirement of cities to go through that planning for inclusion, I think, is going to give a big, nice shock to the system to force them to consider doing something than the status quo. But yeah, I didn't answer your question because I'm not an expert in the things you asked me about.
But you are an expert in so much, and we really appreciate what you've shared with us today, Professor Cashin. This has been great. Thank you all for coming out. I think we're out of time, so let's give her a hearty Rutgers thanks.
Thank you very much.
And once again, I want to thank Professor Cashin and Professor Troutt for being with us today and for this wonderful conversation, and for everyone for coming. Thank you so much for being here, for your fabulous questions. I'm sorry we don't have enough time to get all of the questions, but thanks for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.